Welcome to Crosshatched, everyone. Lately, I've been hearing about the benefits of being curious in life. But one area that can be difficult, even for curious people, is researching competing ideas. I've done this many times when an entrepreneur assumes there isn't competition just because they haven't happened to see it yet. And when confronted with the competition, the reaction is almost always defensive. I've been there too. Discovering things that are a threat to my values and belief systems is tough, but often the hard conversations are worth it. To consider another perspective takes a certain amount of strength. I talk a lot about near-death experiences, or NDEs, on this show, so I buckled up and forced myself to watch an hour-long podcast called Near-Death Experiences Debunked. I'll start by saying that the no-nonsense spiritual podcaster Britt Hartley admits there are holes and things she can't fully understand. But apparently she thinks she has enough to pop off and starts by patronizing us for minutes, saying that she wants to be wrong. That later, when I looked into her background, she's made a career on being an atheist, so I'm not sure that being wrong would really be good for her reputation. Right. So I didn't know that NDE skeptics don't want to entertain any story from someone who wasn't medically declared brain dead. And here's the interesting thing. The definition of brain death includes the term irreversibility. So you technically can't have someone to come back and talk about their NDE because it implies their brain death was reversed. The AMA Journal of Ethics gives a good summary. Since it might be impossible to conclusively demonstrate irreversibility and the loss of all brain functions, acknowledging the limitations of accepted standards is more intellectually honest. It goes on to say, a risk that accepting the mismatch means accepting that some patients' brain death diagnoses will probably be wrong. And the misdiagnosis of irreversible brain death has occurred. National Institute of Health has several links to these situations and says, with a worldwide legal adoption of brain death as death, undoubtedly driven by the society's need for organs, it appears that the medical community has accepted the clinical test criteria for brain death as if they were scientific truths, even though they are fraught with known flaws and problems. Someone else said, at best, there is an approximation of brain death. So you have people who were declared brain dead and came back to life, which means by definition, they were not brain dead since it was reversed. Usually, the protocols for diagnosing brain death that gets reversed were not followed carefully enough. But the definition of brain death has changed 4 times since 1975. As diagnostic equipment improves and we're able to reverse what was previously irreversible, the definition of brain death will probably change again. What we don't see are wild inconsistencies of NDEs from people along the continuum that approaches irreversibility. So it somewhat exposes the agenda of those who say if you're not brain dead, then the experience doesn't count. What do you mean I'm not dead yet? Remember this?
Bring out here's one. 9pence. I'm not dead. What? Nothing. Here's your 9pence. I'm not dead. Here. He said he's not dead. Yes, he is. I'm not. He isn't? Well, he will be soon. He's very ill. I'm getting better. Well, can you hang around a couple of minutes? He won't be long. No, I've got to go to Robinson's. They've lost 9 today. Isn't there something you can do? I feel happy. I feel happy. Oh, thanks very much. That's all.
That was followed by probably the slowest song you will ever hear from Nuclear Assault, called Brain Death. Speaking of, Eben Alexander, a neurosurgeon, had a famous NDE who Britt attacks because he wasn't brain dead and he was just in a coma. Interestingly, Dr. Alexander describes his NDE as way too real to be real. I've had some dreams that were pretty realistic, but never hyper-reality. What even is that? Dr. Alexander isn't the first to have an NDE that makes this reality seem like the dream. But, oh, yeah, he wasn't brain dead, so it doesn't count towards an atheist's unattainable standard for evidence. Now, one valid argument that the no-nonsense spiritualist makes against woo in general was about psychics. Quick aside, if there was a band called Cult of the Psychic Fetus, you'd want to know about it, right? Their song Dead of Night sounds like this. I found a study that showed psychics used by law enforcement showed no statistical proof in their efficacy. I expected there might be some, as some famous psychics will tout this great success, but maybe it is only anecdotal, because the study reports, in relation to crime number 1, 2 of the 12 psychics correctly identified 4 of 21 possible indicators, while the average of all test subjects was 2 of 21 possible indicators. The findings noted, statistically, this is not better than chance. Worse, the clip said, as an experienced homicide investigator, Investigator Janes has had numerous occasions to work with psychic detectives or follow up on information provided by psychics. In every instance, the results were less than impressive. Not only did the psychics not provide any useful information, but they routinely distracted and hampered investigators. Ouch. The report says, despite entertaining portrayals, the use of psychic detectives is not as prevalent as the popular media suggests, nor is their effectiveness as high as the populace is led to believe. So yeah, there weren't a lot of psychics in the study, but the results wouldn't lead you to believe that psychics are good crime solvers. So at another point from this anti-NDE podcast, there's not a lot of evidence supporting that people who have out-of-body experiences can witness something elsewhere and report back. And apparently there was a lot of money thrown at this by the government during the Cold War. Yeah, psychic warfare. But it didn't work. This would be a song called Veteran of Psychic Wars by Blue Oyster Cult. Check it out.
You see me now, a veteran of 1,000 psychic wars. I've been living on the edge so long, where the winds of limbo roar, and I'm hanging up.
I saw them last year. All right. More on the no-nonsense spiritualist. She was also throwing shade by mentioning the common space elves to someone on DMT or absinthe green fairies. Yeah, I can't explain that. I've had absinthe a few times, but the only green fairies I saw were in the Seattle musical Bohemia, which was really outstanding. Though I will add, there was an NDE testimonial from someone who had experience with DMT and said the experiences were nothing alike. Another quote I just read from Connor Lawson about DMT was, if you believe in God, you won't, and if you don't, you will. So DMT is a chemical that some people say is released in our bodies when we die, but it's not universally accepted. But it's interesting how those who say DMT causes NDE hallucinations will speak as if the release of DMT upon death is a universally accepted scientific fact when it actually isn't. Then our spiritual skeptic cites what she calls the really powerful third man syndrome or third hiker effect, which I had never heard of before. And of course she wants to dismiss it by saying it's the brain's way of communicating in a way that convinces one to do something for one's safety. Okay, maybe it's imaginary, maybe it's an angel. I don't know, but this Brit person goes on as many tangents as I do, so I will take this non sequitur excuse and play a tiny clip from one of my favorite bands called Kite, because I haven't shared them yet. This is from Remember Me. die. There are many hospital NDEs where an individual comes back to life with specific information from the other side of the hospital. So what does the know-nothing spiritualist say to this? Okay, all right, maybe that was a bit mean. Maybe she's helping some people in some way. We just disagree on things. To this, she says, you have no idea what your brain knows. And suggested we subconsciously collected this information. And she says we can't really know what they knew before, and then admits that she's struggled to explain some of these stories because some were so specific. And then she goes on a tangent story about a failed experiment that randomly had the right answer. If you think of somebody 100 times and then when they call, you think it's special, forgetting all the other times that you thought of them and they didn't call. So she complains there's no study, but admitted that you can't really know what they knew. There will never and can never be a study that satisfies her suspicions. Over halfway through, she cites an AWARE study by Sam Parnia that didn't find that dead people can spot a hidden object. But she didn't mention a different study by Parnia where 1 out of 6 did answer the question correctly. Then she attacks EEGs that measure brain activity because they can miss something. So at first it doesn't count if the person wasn't brain dead. And then if they are brain dead and come back, well, then, it's because the EEG was inaccurate. Okay. Well, that same researcher, Sam Parnia from NYU, had some other things to say on the subject that the cynical spiritualist left out. Here are a couple clips from his CBS interview called "Researchers Say There's Evidence That Consciousness Continues After Clinical Death."
But what's fascinating is that the cells inside the body, and particularly the cells inside the brain, do not suddenly become annihilated. They go through a process of decay that can take a few hours, which is why we can actually medically bring people back to life after they have technically gone beyond that threshold of death for tens of minutes, if not hours of time afterwards. But interestingly, 2% actually had full awareness, could describe all the events that were going on that were validated. Is that it appears that even though people have gone beyond that threshold of death and their brain has shut down, that entity that we call consciousness, the mind, the psyche, whatever you want to call it, does not seem to become annihilated. From the evidence we have, that at least tens of minutes, if not hours of time afterwards, how long beyond that, we don't know at this point. Because of the medical treatments that they get afterwards in the intensive care unit by doctors such as myself, to save their brain, they forget it. And one of our new studies is trying to actually decipher whether people have had it but just forgotten about it.
Too many times, resuscitated people seem to know things that can be verified and we don't understand. Our sassy spiritualist says it isn't frequent enough for science. It's probably more accurate to say it isn't frequent enough in a controlled setting. But how is science supposed to answer something that is outside of the laws of physics anyway? Then she says that many times in history, at the edge of science, people had a supernatural explanation for something that would later be explained by science. If you ask what are the top phenomena, you find that lightning and thunder was thought to be from the gods, eclipses, earthquakes, sometimes disease. But when you think, oh, these are now understood by science, so therefore science will someday explain NDE stories are just fill in the blank, this analogy doesn't track well, because if you're pondering the supernatural, the spirit world, aren't the testimonials from those who died and came back on a whole different level than plate tectonics? Then she points out that some people are developing a religious faith with NDEs. Guilty. Of course, she criticizes it by saying people into NDEs have fear of death, and the stories offer a lifeline. But if you were going to throw out religion and start from scratch, wouldn't NDEs be a pretty good place to start from? And couldn't it be inspired with a fascination of death, not necessarily a fear? Just in case, here's a clip from a song called "Fear of Dying." Funny thing, then the atheist spiritual advisor has a wardrobe change to come back the next day to go off about G-Lock and how it's just like an NDE. That's why I always wear a black shirt. Keep that continuity if I have to reshoot a bit. Oh, G-Lock is when somebody, often a pilot, experiences intense G-forces. On Wikipedia, the effects are listed as tunnel vision, loss of peripheral vision, retaining only the center vision, gray out, loss of color vision, blackout, and then G-Lock when consciousness is lost. The only other thing on Wikipedia that may have any connection to NDEs is it says, brief but vivid dreams have been reported to follow G-Lock. But no, the atheist spiritualist oxymoron person gives a long list of NDE attributes that she says are found in G-Lock. Bright light, tunnel vision, euphoria, peaceful feelings, life reviews, out-of-body experiences, seeing heavens, floating sensations, bright lights, encountering beings, and dead relatives. So at this point you might be wondering, wow, that's amazing. How come I haven't heard of pilots seeing dead relatives during G-Lock? Did she just debunk NDEs? When I go to find a recent report, which was just a rehashing of an older report, the summary showed one similarity between G-Lock and the subject's NDE, but several differences shown here. Here's the study from University of North Texas. We got G-Lock, NDE, and ADC, which stands for after-death communication. And it goes through these questions, right, 0, 1, 2, and you can see, like, how similar the G-Lock and the NDE is, right? You've got a couple here that are similar. These are across all of them. If I jump to the next page, these had some similarities. But yeah, overall, not that closely tied. So certainly more than one similarity, but didn't see the laundry list that she proclaimed existed. Maybe there are other studies that better substantiate her claims. She did include links in her video description to her book and where you can sign up for her course, not links to the research. Maybe severe G-Lock is so close to death that the similarities are to be expected. On the other hand, why aren't there hellish versions of G-Lock if they're the same as NDEs? And this is what I mean. You hear these myths thrown around like people see what they expect to see after death, but there are many accounts of people seeing the exact opposite of what they would expect. Okay, to wrap up our video that was supposed to make me stop believing in NDEs, in the last 62 seconds, after ranting about how the good feelings are a final gift of brain chemicals sputtering out, she barely mentions that some people have hellish NDEs. Charlotte Marshall, a neuroscientist at the University of Liège in Belgium, was quoted by Scientific American to say that her study of 123 people reported that 14% of NDEs were negative, a number she's sure is an underestimate because of how disturbing these memories can be. Yeah, it's probably a fair bit higher. Who would want to admit to it? So why was distressing NDEs only mentioned once in the last minute of an hour-long video discounting NDEs? Probably because it disrupts her agenda. The G-Lock and biologically programmed brain-spinal gift arguments fall apart when you consider negative NDEs. I thought maybe she's got a whole segment on hellish NDEs that I haven't seen. But her videos on hell are just about how religion uses it as a scare tactic, not on NDEs. So if the brain was hardwired to thrust good feelings throughout the body upon death, how and why would some people have the exact opposite? And why would hellish NDEs often correlate with severely sinful lifestyles or suicide? And before you try to explain it with deep-seated guilt Remember, we're talking about this theory that the brain is pre-programmed to offer one dying last gift. But if this could be disrupted by unresolved guilt, then why aren't people having middle ground NDEs from moderate guilt, and they just imagine walking down Main Street and things aren't particularly good or bad, just average? Why are we almost always hearing about one extreme or the other? In a 2023 report called The Darker Side of Near-Death Experiences from the Journal of Scientific Exploration, analysts attempted to reconcile why some people would have pleasant and what they say is up to 22% would have hellish NDEs. It is said in an unpublished analysis of 443 NDEers from the University of Virginia database, the rate of distressing NDEs was 13% among those who were Roman Catholics at the time of their NDE, 9% among Protestants, 8% among Jews, 6% among atheists, and 6% among agnostics, which were not statistically significantly different. In aggregate, distressing NDEs were reported by 11% of the Christians and 9% of the non-Christians. They also say, neither is it true that people who live saintly lives always have pleasant NDEs, while bad people always have distressing ones. The key word here is always. If you read enough testimonials or watch enough testimonial videos, they definitely hit at a pattern of who is more susceptible to a dark NDE. And like I've been saying, your religion doesn't matter. If you go down a rabbit hole reading or watching these NDEs, note there are a lot of greedy marketers publishing fake AI near-death experience videos. You need to look for those that are interviews on legitimate podcasts and not those that are primarily images with a voice in the background. And sure, even the real testimonials are not 100% consistent. Some of them go from distressing to joyful, and frequently end with the subject being told, it's not your time. But if NDEs in general don't fit one's narrative, they're likely to say there is no evidence. So let's talk about the meaning of evidence for a moment. Have you ever heard someone say there is no evidence supporting a certain topic? And then you look it up and find not one, but several scientific studies on that topic? I've got a recent example of how that word evidence can be misleading. I know this woman in real life. We'll call her Betsy. Betsy was suffering from audio and visual hallucinations for years. She tried lots of pills and antipsychotics, but nothing helped. One day her friend suggested that Betsy could have this gene mutation called MTHFR and that methylfolate could help. Betsy started taking it. Within 2 weeks, her hallucinations decreased 98%. A 98% reduction would seem too significant to call the power of suggestion or the placebo effect. After years of trying all these antidepressants and antipsychotic pills, all Betsy needed was a vitamin. But no MD psychologist or psychiatrist suggested methylfolate. In fact, after Betsy reported this amazing breakthrough to her primary, the doctor said, there is no evidence that methylfolate helps people with the MTHFR gene mutation. And yet the Amazon description for methylfolate names the gene mutation in the product description. So we're living in a world where the writing can be on the wall and it's so obvious, but the experts will claim there is no evidence. It's like there really isn't an objective definition of evidence. What they mean to say is there's not enough evidence for me. At some point you got to ask, why does the bar for evidence get set so high? Does someone have an agenda? Like to sell more patented pharmaceuticals instead of promoting an over-the-counter vitamin? One more thing I'll say about Betsy and hidden agendas. Most of her hallucinations encourage self-harm. I couldn't help but wonder why. You'd think a corrupted mind would manifest more jumbled, random hallucinations like animal hybrids and frying eggs on the ceiling. But to me, at least, there appeared to be an orchestrated agenda, like an evil that wants to infiltrate and do its worst. So take your vitamins, kids. So don't necessarily believe it when someone says there is no evidence. In the comments of the debunking NDE video, someone brings up the obvious. Blind people who have been blind from birth have had NDEs where they can suddenly see. And yes, there was a specific study on that had about a dozen people, and I'm talking about people who didn't even have shadows or colors, people who were completely blind and then could suddenly see very clearly in their NDE. The haters respond, "They're completely anecdotal and no controlled experiments have been conducted to provide any actual rigorous investigation of the matter." Someone else says, "Never happened." Sound defensive? Read the study for yourself. I'll put it in the description. And guess what? There are common themes between NDEs of people blind from birth, people brain dead, and people not brain dead. And some of you might think, this is great. Evidence for life after death. What a relief. Why are so many people refuting it? Could it be that religion has such a nefarious track record that many are too jaded? Even religious people will refute NDEs because the testimonials are contradictory to what their religion teaches. Or maybe there are implications of believing in a spirit world that we might be held responsible for our actions in this world. In conclusion, this no-nonsense spiritualist has another video where she says, atheism is the natural goal of Christianity. She posits that because God withdraws itself from us in Christian doctrine, it is only natural that Christians withdraw from God into atheism. Yeah, like, what? But a flaw in this argument comes back to a common NDE theme that suggests we agreed to this distance. That somehow in the space-time continuum, it was our choice to have this life experience. A life experience that creates a freedom and a delicate balance of good and evil. I think about our temperature tolerance on Earth, or in the shower, compared to the temperature extremes in the universe. We're in such a narrow band here. I'd guess that good and evil are fairly muted compared to their potential. Some have compared coming to Earth school with muscle development, like going through life on Earth beefs up our spiritual core. I'm not ready for that crop top tank top yet, but I'm working on it. All right, to wrap up, I'm not sure I've mentioned that only about 20% of people who died and came back have a near-death experience to report. If it was 0%, I'd say the atheists would have a very strong position. Can you imagine how hard it would be to be spiritual or religious if no one ever came back to life with more than random dreams? Talk about faith. I guess that's how it used to be when hardly anyone was resuscitated. Now that there are so many resuscitations, with some fairly consistent stories from the other side, I'd need more faith to be an atheist than pretend the tales from death's door were random, meaningless stories, even though we've got more information to support the existence of the supernatural. Let's stay curious. And remember, you can be detached and still subscribe to Crosshatched.